80% of the migrants that live in the world have done so in a safe and orderly way. But we cannot forget the tragedies that we witness every day in deserts, in the sea, everywhere, where people trying to have a better life put themselves in the hands of traffickers and smugglers that dramatically violate their human rights and cause so many to die.
Today, more than 160 countries agreed to adopt the UN's Global Compact for Safe, Orderly and Regular Migration. The pact addresses, the UN says, growing global migration and lays out 23 objectives for treating migrants humanely. But the U.S. didn't sign on, and neither did countries like Hungary and Austria, after their leaders expressed fears that the document would encroach on their national sovereignty. The United Nations insists it's a non-binding agreement. The pact also caused controversy here in Canada, where the Conservatives have attacked the Liberals for agreeing to sign on, and the issue had some big consequences in Belgium. This weekend, the coalition of parties governing that country fell apart after the Prime Minister decided to sign the pact. The Flemish National Party, the New Flemish Alliance, pulled its support for the government. That means the remaining parties that form the ruling coalition don't hold a majority in the legislature, so the Prime Minister is now holding on to power with a minority government, hoping to avoid the collapse of the government before planned elections in May. We're back with the Power Panel: Brad, Yolande, Rachel, and JP. Brad, I'll start with you. Why do you think this was so controversial? I mean, the fact that it led to the end of the government in Belgium is pretty significant.
Yeah, it is. I think it's because the global conservative movement wanted to use this opportunity to flex its muscles in the countries in which it has a lot of authority. And pick on migrants who are fleeing famine and fleeing war. And that is consistent with what we've seen conservatives do for the last number of years. And it's heartbreaking to see. And this pact, this basically this non-binding agreement is being used by conservatives, even in this country, as somehow encroaching on our national sovereignty, which is ridiculous and a misfire. I really think it's a misfire by Mr. Scheer here in Canada and by conservatives throughout the world, because I think that this is our time to come together as people and come up with an aspirational way to deal with this the worst migration levels that we've seen since the Second World War, and doing nothing is not an option. This does not harm Canada's sovereignty on choosing how it deals with migrants. And to Mr. Scheer and all the conservatives who feel that this is an encroachment on our sovereignty, I ask them to point to the pacts. What is the policing mechanism? There is none. And what are the penalties for not abiding by the general agreements? This is aspirational. This is for all of us to have a level set on how we're going to deal with this crisis. And it should be celebrated and not fought. Okay,
I'll give Rachel a chance to respond to that.
Well, let's dispense with this myth that because it's formally non-binding, at least for the moment, that it does not have a great deal of political weight and potentially legal weight as well. The Paris Accord is non-binding. The UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples was non-binding. Both of those have essentially now been incorporated into Canadian law. The UN DRIP, formally, of course, incorporated into Canadian law. The whole point of these agreements is that they influence international norms and international laws, and eventually domestic laws as well. So the fact that it is, formally non-binding is a bit of a red herring. And there are some legitimate concerns in this document that deserve to be addressed and that deserve to be talked about without, again, accusing people of being anti-immigrant or anti-migrant or racist for raising those questions. So, for instance, the document does not distinguish between true refugees who are facing, a genuine fear of persecution and economic migrants who simply want to move to Canada or elsewhere for a better standard of living. And that's a really important distinction in Canadian law, and it's not one that's made in this agreement, for instance. So we have a situation right now where we're taking in roughly 2,000 migrants a month. They're irregular migrants, often unsafe crossings, largely uncontrolled. And how is this agreement going to impact that situation on our southern border, for instance? There's been no discussion of that. So I think there are legitimate questions, and those are just being swept under the rug.
I think there are some pot stirrers out there that want to convince people there'll be hordes of migrants at our gates and they'll be forced to take them all in because of this compact. I think that's probably not true. But I take Rachel's point that there is a caveat to all this, because some experts believe now that Canada has adopted this compact, it could be used in future legal challenges if migrants or refugees are challenging a rejection from the refugee board to admit them into this country. It depends how the domestic courts interpret it, basically. It does depend on that, but just having been a party to this agreement might have some legal implications for future refugee claimant decisions. I should also add there's one part of this agreement that gives me tremendous pause, and that's the whole part that says that there should be sensitizing and educating of media professionals on migration issues. This seems like a re-education campaign or something. It also encourages defunding media outlets that promote xenophobia, racism, and tolerance towards migrants. Who decides what is xenophobic or intolerant to migrants? Is there some overarching international body that's going to come down on individual journalists and say, you're not representing migrants fair enough and we're going to take away like government funding for your organization, which is a whole other debate, I'm sure. But that does make me question like this whole agreement. That does seem a little like it's intruding in Canadian sovereignty, at least in one important aspect. Is there any way, Yolande, to, I guess, would there have been any other way to address the sort of, I mean, like to Brad's point, there is a huge issue with refugees globally, right? It is an international crisis, and I think the intent is obviously to address the fact that there could be more cooperation internationally to address that issue. But did it have to be done this way? Because it isn't just, you know, the U.S. saying that they're worried about this. There are a number of countries, and they're not all in Eastern Europe either. There's Italy, for example. We mentioned Belgium, Australia. So what do you think, Israel? What do you think about that?
Well, I think to begin with, I think not only should there be a conversation, history is going to judge Canada and the world as to how we're handling the situation at this point. I really do sincerely believe that. I understand that the political leadership, not just government, has a responsibility in really addressing people's fears and preoccupations and issues with respect to what the impact of any agreement is on the country. But where I have a real problem, it becomes difficult to be able to do that when whether it's conservatives or politicians weaponize these tools as to reiterate their own issues with respect to migration or immigration in general. And that's what has happened with this pact. I mean, I could add to the list that you made at the top of the segment. Don't forget Marine Le Pen and Steve Bannon calling this the pact with the diable. Mm-hmm. So how are you to have a conversation to really address, because I think it's a mistake not to address people's concern and just say, oh no, you're being racist or whatnot. But it's really difficult to do that when people are spewing false information that's not written black on white on the document, or that you're fearing people, telling people that foreign bureaucrats are going to be controlling our migration when that's not happening. I mean, when you look at not just the principles that are enumerated there, but the role that Canada can play in terms of not having the perfect system, but we do have one, whereas in other countries in the world where they don't, sharing best practices, improving on our practices, making sure that we make sure that the countries of origin are in a better place economically and socially, human rights wise, as well as an important role that I want our country to be able to play. And I don't think that we should tear away from that, and that should not be a partisan thing. But every time, and I know that coming from here, I can tell you we have frequent debates on these issues. For whatever reason, in the last few years, we are unable politically to have this kind of conversation with sound mind and strong fact-based arguments.
Okay, really quickly, Brad, I have 30 seconds left.
You know, conservatives have no problem signing trade deals that transfer sovereignty from the legislatures or the parliament here in Canada to other places. But when it comes to looking out for migrants and treating migrants well, the reason why we have the Declaration for the Rights of Indigenous People is because we passed a motion in our parliament. And the Paris Accord is right. These are aspirational goals. And we should be aspiring to them, and we should be at the forefront of the leadership of having that conversation, because hate is on the rise on this planet, and unless we come together as a community of nations and say these are the norms that we want to have, I think the hate is going to win out.
Okay, really quickly.
Well, look, there's rhetoric on both sides of the issue, and Brad's comments are a good example of that, because Conservatives in Canada have never opposed legal immigration. In fact, under the former Prime Minister,
But they're opposed to this
the immigration numbers were expanded. So it's not an anti-immigrant position. It's
No, and I
deciding
never said that,
who
Rachel.
comes to
Practical
Canada and
concerns.
how they come, and making sure the integrity of our system is maintained. And that's the concern, and that is simply not being addressed.
Okay, I'm sure this discussion will continue for weeks to come. Thanks, everyone. Thanks to the Power Panel, Brad Levine, Yolande James, Rachel Curran, and JP Tasker.